So I don't know if this is an Eastern Coast thing, for Americans of course, but in my little town there is a twice the ice station. Basically, you can fill up water jugs in 5 gallons and get ice bags for cheaper than you could at the grocery store. I went out a few nights ago to get some water, because honestly, who wants to be drinking tap water anyway? My husband was at home, and because I'm kind of heavily pregnant at the moment, he insisted that he go instead. I wish that he would've. It was about 1 a.m. around this time, dark for miles around, and smack dab in the middle of nowhere. As I got out of my car, I opened the back seat to get the gallon jugs and closed the door. As soon as I did this though, a dark blue truck turned van pulled up perpendicular behind me. Presumably so I couldn't get out if I decided to get back in my car. Immediately, alarm bells started going off. Those bells started screaming at me when the slide door opened suddenly and 2 very large men jumped out. There was about a 20-foot distance between them and me, so I did the very first thing I could think of. I pulled out my phone. I answered a phone call from my husband. "Hey honey, yeah, I'm almost home." As soon as they saw me answer the phone, one of the guys shouted out, "Shit, damn it!" They both got back in the car and peeled out of the lot, tires squealing and all. I threw my unfilled jugs back into my car and locked all the doors 1,000,000 times or more. I broke down and called my husband for real this time. He told me to do my best to write down the make and model of the car, the color, and then we'd go to the police station in the morning. About 2 days later, there was breaking news of a pregnant woman that had just gone missing. She was abducted, and her father swore up and down that she wouldn't just leave. I know it was those men in the blue van. I told the police everything I know. I don't know if they targeted me because I was a woman all alone in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, I think they targeted me because I was pregnant. I don't want to think about what would have happened to me or my baby. I've had a couple of strange encounters while out camping, but this one definitely unsettled me the most of all. I was about 30 years old at this time. My girlfriend and I had decided to go camping for a couple of nights in a spot she knew of that was just south of Squamish, BC. It wasn't any sort of official campground or anything like that, but it was a spot that you pulled over and parked by the side of the highway to get into. We did that and then trekked with our gear into the woods that were between the highway and Howe Sound, which is the waterway that Squamish is at the northern end of. I should also mention that this was about a decade before any of the highway improvements that were made for the Olympics. After about 20 minutes of walking along an easy, well-used trail, we got to this area where there were a few old foundations from abandoned houses and buildings, including at least one with an intact set of concrete stairs. This spot also opened up onto a very nice beach on the ocean and had an open space to set up the tent beside the trail we had been walking along. Within half an hour, our tent was set up, the fire was prepared, and I had chopped enough wood for that entire night. I decided to go have a look at how much further the trail went. My girlfriend took her journal down to the beach to write a bit. I wasn't gone for very long at all, as within just a few hundred yards the trail came to an abrupt end at the base of a cliff. It was maybe 40 to 50 feet high and ran out into the water in one direction, then out of eyeshot in the other. I did try to follow it inland, but the forest became quite dense very quickly, so I had to stop within 30 minutes of exploring. I headed back over to our camp and headed down to the beach. My girlfriend and I spent the rest of the afternoon there, and around 6 p.m. went back to our site. I started up the fire, we cooked some dinner and had some wine together. So far, this was shaping up to be a very nice little getaway. After tidying everything up and letting the fire die down a bit, we got ready for bed and slipped into the tent to go to sleep. For whatever reason though, I decided to grab the axe from the stump that I had used to split the firewood earlier and brought it into the tent with me. Normally, this was not something I would do when camping. I thought perhaps it was because of the unofficial nature of this campsite. As is usually the case when camping, I fell asleep almost immediately. The exercise and fresh air do it for me every time. While I was asleep, a storm system seemed to have rolled in, and it started to rain very heavily. Being the good Cub Scout I was, I had taken the time to spread a tarp out over our tent, so fortunately none of the rain was actually impacting the tent itself. Much was being blocked by the wind as well. We were nice and snug inside, but that storm was making some real loud sounds, which of course made it very hard to go back to sleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I had just managed to fall into a light sleep when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming down the trail. By this time of night, the storm had mostly passed by, and the only other sound was very light rain smacking against the tarp. I sat halfway up. Through the tent material, I could see a light slowly coming down the trail, matching those footsteps. That got my attention real quickly. Who the fuck was out here in the middle of the night walking along this trail that was well off the beaten path and ended about a football field past where we were? Suddenly, the light and the footsteps stopped moving, and the light went out. What the fuck? It's one thing to be out here walking alone in the middle of the night, but why would you feel the need to extinguish your torch as well? The footsteps resumed coming towards us, but now at a much slower speed and much softer as well, like they were trying to sneak along without us noticing. I reached over and my hand grasped the axe firmly. I took the cover off and softly nudged my girlfriend. Don't say anything, but someone is approaching the campsite on the trail. She gave me a quizzical look. I shrugged my shoulders and nodded in the direction the person was coming from. Almost immediately, she picked up on the sound of footsteps, which were much closer and slower now. We looked at each other with freaked out expressions. I showed her my axe and she looked a bit relieved, though I was not any sort of axe master or anything like that. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, very close to the tent. For about 5 or 10 minutes, there was no movement from outside, although we could hear whoever it was breathing heavily. Finally, I called out, "Hey, whoever's out there, do you need some help or something?" Once I said that, the flashlight turned back on and shone through our tent a few times, around our campsite a few more. Abruptly, the person began to walk down the trail again in the direction of that huge cliff. Very quickly, they were out of sight down the trail. I took that opportunity to get my jeans and boots on in case there was some sort of further weirdness when they came back. There was, after all, nowhere for them to go once they reached that cliff. After about 20 minutes of waiting, they still hadn't returned yet. I got out of the tent and started up a fire. My girlfriend got dressed and came out to join me. After about another 20 or 30 minutes, we made some coffee and sat there keeping warm by the fire. We sat there together until the sun finally came up. No one ever came back down that trail. Once it was fully bright out, I took the axe and made my way along the path until I got there. That cliff was still there, just as impassable as I remembered it, with thick forest to one side and the ocean on the other. Not a single sign of last night's visitor to be seen. I slowly made my way back to the campsite, looking carefully to each side to see if there were any side trails I had missed. But no. We packed up and left immediately. To this day, I have no idea who this person was, where they even came from, or how they just mysteriously disappeared. Needless to say, though, I never went back to camp there ever again. A few years ago, my husband and I were heading south to Texas for the winter on Halloween in our motorhome. We stopped briefly for a potty break at the first rest stop, over the border into Missouri. The rest area was quite huge, but there were not many vehicles there at this time. We parked in the area where trucks and RVs park. I did notice 2 cars backed in on the other side. I thought it was quite strange that they were both backed in like that. My husband stayed behind to rearrange some things in the storage bay. As I walked to the restroom, I heard 2 pops. I thought they sounded a lot like gunshots. I walked toward the sound. I heard another pop and saw something black fall to the parking lot. At first, I thought to myself, this is Halloween. Is this somebody's sick idea of a joke or something? Was it perhaps a wild dog? A man then looked my way, and I ducked behind an electrical box immediately. When I peeked out, the man casually walked to his car and slowly left, getting back onto the expressway. I walked over to where the man had just been to see what was there on the pavement, only to realize it was a woman's body. She was lying face down. I can still visualize her black jacket, shorts, and sandals on her feet, but mostly her long black hair blowing lifelessly in the wind. Immediately, I turned around and ran towards my husband, screaming, "Call 911! Someone's been shot!" We had no idea the address of where we were, but within just 10 minutes, there were around 15 police cars and EMS screeching their way in. We were held there for 5 hours in the rain, giving statements and eyewitness accounts. Needless to say, by the time we got to our intended campsite, I was a shaking, messed up basket case. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that woman fall to the ground and begin bleeding, and that man looking in my way. I was sure he was going to hunt me down and kill me, since I had just seen him murder someone. About 9 months later, they found him in Texas. He was found guilty of murder and is currently in jail. At least, I hope so. The woman was homeless and living in her car. The man killed her because he asked her for money, and she used a racial slur at him, apparently. Her family at the court meeting also said she was paranoid someone was going to kill her, and that's why she drove around in her car all the time. This was very scary to me, and I still relive the memory sometimes. This is a memory that I've always remembered vividly and still frightens me to this day. So, when I was around 9 years old or so, and my brother was 8, we had an experience that's very hard to explain, and quite frankly, very terrifying. It started while we were laying in bed. Now, we didn't sleep together, but we did have rooms just across from each other, with a bathroom and hallway separating us. Our house was a one-story. Both my brother and I had rooms that had a window that led out to 2 separate porches, a front porch and a back porch. My window was located in the front, and my brother's was located in the back. Clearly an ideal setup for any intruder that wanted easy access to a middle-class family. I mean, back then, my brother and I were pretty expendable, I guess, so yeah. Anyway, we were there in bed and talking across the hall from each other whilst in bed. We had to lean out from our beds to see each other while we talked. From my view, I could see him and the window that led to the back porch. The window had its blinds down, so I couldn't see anything that was outside of it, if there was anything. We were talking, and very swiftly an hour passed by. We were both getting pretty tired, so we said goodnight and tried to settle in for the night. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard it, a whistle. Not just one, but a few, and not like standard whistling either. Rather, it was like someone was singing along to a tune. The only way I can describe its manner was sing-song. It sounded like the whistling was coming from my brother's room, so I assumed it must be him. But why would he be whistling like some barber from the 50s? It was so strange and creepy sounding. I leaned out of bed to tell my brother to shut up and stop doing that. But instead, I saw my brother staring back at me with a terrified look on his face. "Was that you?" "No, I thought that was you." The hair on the back of my neck stood up and was immediately at attention. I was pretty scared at this point, but I still needed to figure out what was going on. I got out of bed and rushed to my brother's bedroom. I jumped into his bed and we stared at the window, waiting to meet our maker. We waited for a good 10 minutes or so for anything, and nothing came. We were starting to doubt we'd even heard it in the first place when the whistling began again. The same tune, same cadence, same song, but this time it was longer and much more pronounced. Who the hell was out here casually whistling around our house at 11 at night? My brother and I didn't know what to do. We clutched each other as we heard what we thought might be a mass murderer outside my brother's window or something. Then it stopped, just as abruptly as it started. Boom! There was a huge crash on the back porch that sent us into a massive panic. I scrambled out of my brother's bed and sprinted to my parents' room. My brother and I woke them out of their slumber to warn them of this person terrorizing us on the back porch. Thankfully, they took us very seriously and climbed out of bed immediately. They walked to the back door as we followed. When they opened the door, there was a big hush that fell over everything. The only sound that could be heard was crickets chirping in the dark. However, the porch was lit up from the motion sensor floodlights on the corner of the house, just nearest to my brother's window. I don't know whether there was someone outside my brother's window or not, but the whistling I heard that night was the single most frightening thing I've ever heard. It's never happened again at my house either, but it's haunted both me and my brother for years. When I was in my early 20s, I lived in an apartment with my mom, brother, and my 2 sons, who were toddlers at the time. The guy who lived next door was about 60 years old and worked for the cable company. He had always given me some very creepy vibes. Around this time, we were upgrading our internet, and another guy who worked for the same cable company came out to do the install. If I thought my neighbor was creepy, he had nothing on this guy. I was in and out while he was there that day, but every time we were in the same room, he would stare at me with this strange look on his face for a really, really long amount of time. The next day was Saturday, and my creepy neighbor must have been having a little get-together or something. To my dismay, the creep who had done our install was at the party as well. It was clear that they had been drinking all day and were getting louder and more obnoxious as the day wore on. A little bit after 8 p.m., both my mom and my brother left, leaving me there alone with my 2 young sons. Around 8:30, there was a sudden knock on my door. There stood that creepy installation guy. The man was very clearly drunk and told me he had forgotten to have my mom sign some document the previous day. I told him, no problem, I'll just sign it now. He started to take a step to enter my apartment. I positioned myself so he couldn't get through the door. Again, I said I'd just sign whatever he needed right now. He pointed toward the kitchen and said he had given my mom the document and it was now in our house. He pushed the door and tried to shove me out of the way and aggressively tried to step inside my apartment. This time, I made a more forceful block of his attempt. At that point, he turned his head to his left and said something to someone. I moved just enough to see who he was talking to. It was my creepy neighbor, who was standing with his back up against the wall of my apartment, so he was just out of my line of sight. I quickly stepped back in and shut and locked my door immediately. I saw the both of them start to walk away. I knew then that the situation was super shady, but I didn't know just how shady until I was telling my family what happened. Why would this guy need a signature on a document he left with my mom? Why would he come at 8:30 at night when he had been drinking all day? Why did they wait until just moments after everybody else left, something they would have definitely seen? And why was my neighbor standing where I couldn't see him? I'm glad that my creep radar was on full alert that night, because it really scares me to think what might have happened if I had just let him walk into my apartment. Here's my story. As a military brat who grew up in Japan while attending school on a US military installation, I graduated in the early 2000s. Following graduation, most of my graduating class moved back to the US to pursue college or start their adult lives. Most would leave and never return to Japan. My parent is Japanese though, so I had every reason to return. It was December and I had just returned home to Japan after my fall semester at college. Much to my relief, it seemed a couple of my friends had chosen to remain in Japan after high school. I had friends to hang out with while home on vacation. One evening, I was out joyriding with my buddies. We had nowhere particularly important to be, just driving around aimlessly. Occasionally, we'd stop by popular hangouts for young adults, hoping to meet some cute Japanese girls to flirt with. I mean, how else would a couple of young 19-year-old dudes want to spend an evening anyway? My friend, who I'll call Jay, had a 90s Nissan Silvia, and he was obsessed with drifting. Truth be told, he was not particularly good at it. You really couldn't fault the guy for trying, though. That evening, he suggested we take off to Asamizo Park near our hometown of Sagamihara. This large public park had many parking lots peppered throughout its grounds. There were lots of prime locations for him to practice whipping his car around back and forth, while not causing damage or fender benders. Without hesitation, we all agreed and headed in that direction. About 20 minutes later, we're passing the main entrance to Asamizo. During the day, this is a pleasant public park with many recreational activities going on. Japan, in comparison to other countries, is a very safe country. This park was no exception to that notion. However, it did have some unfortunate events happen there. After driving into the park for about 7 minutes, we reached the first parking lot. It was around 10 o'clock at night. We pulled in and parked. I hopped out of the car and pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes and lit one up. The evening was brisk. I gazed around, letting my night vision calibrate as the lights far off in the distance twinkled. My other friend with us, R, also lit a cigarette, and we proceeded to have a conversation about whether Jay would even be able to get his car sideways. Jay pulled out and began to whip his car around the lot. As he spun counterclockwise, the wailing of his tires attempting to grip the asphalt broke the silence in the evening. Even now, I can still close my eyes and remember that smell of burning rubber. Adjacent to the parking lot, there was a tree line that led into some thick brush and wooded area. The park was known for its green belts scattered through it. I remember looking over my shoulder a few times that evening because I kept getting this feeling we were being watched from out in the woods. Each time I scanned the tree line, though, I wouldn't see anything out of the ordinary. What happened next would cause me to jump so hard that I laugh even now when thinking about it. The cell phone in my right pocket suddenly started ringing and vibrating. I jumped up with fright. The fact that light paranoia had set in from watching the tree lines did not help with the anxiety experienced from this unexpected phone call. As I was attending college in the States and only back on vacation, I no longer had a cell phone in Japan. In fact, my younger sister had lent her phone to me so that I could be reached if necessary. I pulled out my phone, thinking it must be her or my mother, calling for something. None of my friends even had this number. As I looked down at the green backlit LCD screen, though, I saw displayed in Japanese a restricted number. I thought that was strange, but figured maybe my sister was just calling from a public phone. Yes, those were still a thing back then. I answered the phone. Moshi moshi. There was nothing but silence for a response. I remembered hearing a bit of static. Then I finally began to hear the voice of a Japanese girl. My immediate thoughts, of course, were that this must be a friend of my sister, so I explained that I was her brother and just borrowing her phone for that evening. If she needed to get a hold of my sister, she should bring the house instead. The girl apologized, and I reassured her that no harm had been done and promptly ended the call. I placed the cell phone back in my pocket and focused on the ruckus of noise coming from Jay's car. Not 10 minutes later, though, the cell phone in my pocket began to ring again. This time, I was sure it had to be my sister or mother. Earlier that day, I left home and didn't say where I was going or when I planned on coming home. It wasn't uncommon for my mother or sister to call and ask if I had eaten dinner yet or if they should leave food out for when I would be returning. I pulled the phone out once again. I had a phone call. A restricted number once more. I answered the phone. The same voice of that Japanese girl was on the other end. Before I could ask why she was calling for my sister, she cut me off. Based on the previous phone call, I thought there were a couple of funny things going on here. I know most of my sister's friends and recognized their voice over the phone as well. This girl, on the other hand, didn't sound familiar at all. Additionally, my sister never mentioned anything about new friends, and her circle was very tight. She wasn't very big on being a social butterfly, you see. Perhaps I was wrong, though. My sister was 3 years junior to me after all, so my assumption was this girl had to be around my sister's age and way too young for me. I had very little interest in engaging in conversation. The girl started to probe me with questions, and I kept my answers vague. I don't know why I continued to entertain a conversation with her. but a hang-up I supposed might just be very rude. Suddenly though, she asked me what me and my friends were doing out in the park so late in the evening. I almost began to answer when it dawned on me. I did not mention anything about where I was or what we were doing. I had never told her I was at a park. The girl giggled and tried to play it off, insisting she thought I said I was there. I told her this was too weird, and then I hung up. Jay had grown tired of drifting in this lot. He pulled up to us, and from the driver's side suggested we change up the scenery. R and I hopped back in the vehicle and off we went. Now at another parking lot we hopped out, and Jay continued to do his thing. This lot had soccer fields not too far off from it, and the lamps in the lot painted an orange hue, which was kind of oddly comforting. Strangely enough though, that feeling of being watched soon returned to me. I swung around to my right and stared at the empty field on the other side of the parking lot fence. There was nothing there though. At this point, Jay parked his car and shut it off. Now silence and a thin film of burnt rubber veiled the parking lot. R started asking what was up with all those phone calls, and I began to explain what happened. They both agreed it was a little bit strange, but speculated maybe my sister had mentioned to her friends that her older brother was back in town. Jay proceeded to tease me that I should start talking to this chick, but I protested because I had no interest in someone that age. Suddenly, my phone rings again. Same restricted phone number. This time, the girl was much more aggressive. "How come you guys left? What was wrong with that last spot?" I asked what she meant. She then told me, "You guys left the last parking lot you were at." I remember the hairs standing up on the back of my neck immediately. I made it a point to be vague, but somehow this girl knew what I was doing, that we had left, and where we were now. Something was not right here. I hung up immediately. A moment later, my phone was blowing up. I answered again, this time very irate. "What the fuck do you want from me?" There was silence, and then I heard a bit of light static. In a sort of hushed whisper, I heard her voice. "I'm at the field. I see you." I spun around and faced the field looking for any sign of a person. I remember my heart racing as I fumbled to figure out what exactly was going on here. "What do you mean? What do you mean you see me at the field?" She told me she could see me standing with my friends, wearing my gray jacket next to my buddy's car. She told me she was coming over to us, and that all she wanted was to hang out. The line went dead. I looked at Jay and R and gave them the rundown. They both had weird looks on their faces. I knew them well enough to know when they were lying or pulling my leg, but they looked clueless. My phone rang again. "Hey, I'm almost there. Will you wait for me?" "Huh? No, what the hell is going on here? Why do you keep asking me these questions? How do you know where I'm at? Just who are you anyway? I know all my sister's friends, and I don't recognize your voice." "I never said I knew your sister." At this point, I was like, what the fuck? I looked back at the field and couldn't see anyone. As I was still on the phone, I asked where she was at. She just kept saying she would be there shortly. I'm sure my friend sensed the panic in my voice. Jay went on and on about how nobody knows we're out here. How did this chick seem to have our location the entire time? Mind you, this was 2000. Social media, Internet 2.0, and smartphones were not a thing yet. People couldn't just get your location like that. On top of that, we were many kilometers out of the way. You don't just randomly run into people out here. The evening was getting later. It was past 11 p.m., and I had no explanation as to what was going on. My phone rang again. Before I could even answer hello, she asked if I could see her. I was spinning, jerking like a laundry machine agitator at this point. Ari yanked the phone from my hand and proceeded to speak to her as well. Feeling like this was a joke, he decided to toy with her a bit. He started to ask her what she was wearing. She began explaining something to him, from what I could hear from how he responded. He asked her what color her undergarments were, and then she abruptly hung up. He thought he had annoyed her enough that she may not bother calling again. We all nervously chuckled as we couldn't even begin to understand what had just transpired. My phone started to blow up again though. Same deal, restricted number. I answered again, this time upset, but I was cut off immediately. Her voice was much louder now. I could hear what sounded like wind in the background. She began saying she was approaching us, yelling not to leave. She wanted to be with us. All of a sudden, I could hear Jay drop a soda can as he faced the field. "What the fuck is that?" I remember Jay saying in disbelief. I hung the phone up. I looked at both my friends and Jay motioned to jump in the car. We all jumped in, and he stomped on the gas as we made our escape. My phone rang again. I looked. Although I didn't want to answer, I felt as though I needed to. I took the call and I could hear her voice, this time slightly huskier. "It's such a shame that you all left before I could reach you." Jay was now frantically driving away from the park. All that time, I had no idea where he was taking us. It was quiet in the car as I held the phone up to my ear. "I guess I'll just need to follow you. Maybe I'll find you at the Family Mart you're going to stop at." She gave a creepy laugh. "What the hell do you mean by the Family Mart we're going to?" Before I realized it, Jay cut the wheel hard and pulled to the side of the road. He threw on his four-way hazard lights and brought the car to a sudden stop. R damn near hit the dashboard, sitting in the shotgun seat. Jay turned and looked at me. I still remember the paleness of his face. He called into the phone. "How did you know I was taking us to Family Mart?" I hung up the phone and powered it off. We sat in silence for a moment. This felt like a weird dream or something. I told Jay, "Let's get out of here. We need to go somewhere else." Shortly after, we drove to a 24-hour restaurant that was our hangout spot, where many of our Japanese friends frequented. We just wanted somewhere brightly lit and somewhat crowded to chill out at. As we walked up to the entrance, I could see some friends occupying a booth. We walked in and proceeded to join the party. After we ordered some coffee, we started explaining the strange occurrences of that night. Initially, everyone looked on with excitement, but as I explained the story more, the look of excitement written on everyone's face eventually faded, and it got awfully quiet. Another female friend of mine who sat across from me, I'll call her A-chan, looked at me and asked again the whereabouts in the park we were at. As she asked me this, I could see her make eye contact with her boyfriend H. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it as he went into his explanation. "Well, you guys, you all know what happened at Azamizo Park, right?" We all exchanged a blank glance. There was an incident that happened in that park one evening. A girl was walking through the park. Someone approached her and dragged her into the greenbelt, where she was raped and strangled. I heard some rumors about some bad juju associated with the area or something. In disbelief, I scoffed. "You can't be serious, right?" Without any hesitation, he looked me dead in the eye. "Nope, I'm not joking, but you need to go to a shrine. Maybe her spirit latched onto you or something." Now, I don't know if it was really a ghost or what all that was, but I do know it was one of the scariest fucking things that ever happened to me in my life.
Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the world of cryptids, so be sure to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was driving from Atlanta to Lexington with my girlfriend to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are less people on the road and I can take my time. It was 3 a.m. and we were making good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked us up some coffee. We were due in about an hour. My girlfriend was sleeping soundly, and I'm listening to a quiet radio humming away. I start getting a little drowsy and take a sip. Road was just as my coffee. No cars in sight except for a few spotted on the side of the road here and there. In the distance I could make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but I can't really tell due to poor lighting. As I get closer, I start to notice other things, like how this person is kind of thin and tall, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up to this thing now. It's about 20 feet away, and it turns and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person, and it's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. It was a deer, or I tell myself it was. I've seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do this. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first sighting it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human, Standard biped stance, arms back, chin down. But the worst part were the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were two large black pits, almost black hole-ish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it, I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake up my girlfriend to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell, I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station, I had a complete meltdown. I began crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breathe, or do anything, but I wanted to curl into a ball and cry. After 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon, I'll dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat, and she'll tease me about it, or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me over the one thing I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw. I know it will haunt me for the rest of my days. This takes place in April of 2013. Me and a friend had just been to the movies and was just walking around at about 10:45 p.m. when we decided that we should take a shortcut through the schoolyard of our old school, which had since been abandoned. It was in pretty bad shape. As we walked through the schoolyard, we decided to try and get inside the school building to explore a little bit. Now, the school consists of two wings, so the building is an L shape if viewed from above. It is 3 stories tall and has 3 entrances. The main entrance leads to a kind of main hall which connects the two wings. Each wing has staircases at each end of the corridors, which lead to the different floors. One of the windows right by the entrance to the lower wing was actually wide open, so we could easily get in. We were now in the basement. We used our cell phones as flashlights and made sure not to point them towards the windows to avoid being seen. Even though the building was not in use, there was still a lot of stuff just left lying around. Musical equipment, uniforms, a pool table, chairs, so we were just exploring each room in the basement to see if we could find anything cool. We explored for about 15 minutes before we headed up to the first floor, and we were now in the main hall. There was some kind of tarp or large plastic sheet hanging there to separate the hall and the lower wing for some reason. I assume it was for some kind of construction work. We went down one of the corridors and started exploring the classrooms. Every classroom had either been vandalized or suffered some kind of water damage, so everything was very broken or rotting. In hindsight, I think we're lucky the floors didn't collapse on us. We had just come out of the 3rd classroom and were in the corridor when we heard someone moving the tarp and plastic sheeting in the main hall. This was not the wind or anything, and we could definitely tell something was physically moving it. We could also hear footsteps, although the rhythm of the steps was kind of odd. It sounded like someone changed their walking pace sporadically. We immediately went inside a classroom to hide, as we thought someone had called security on us. We hid behind the door in the classroom for about 2 minutes, dead quiet. We didn't hear anything else during this time, so we figured it had to be the wind or just random noise. We decided to push on. We went through the corridor and up the stairs in the other end of the main hall and explored the 2nd floor. While we were there, we would occasionally hear some noises, but we just brushed it off as wind. After a while, we had explored the rest of the corridor, as we decided to walk down the staircase that led from the 2nd floor to the hall. Halfway down the staircase, there was this plateau before the 2nd set of stairs, and this is where things took a turn. We could see the plastic from there, and it was moving. We also heard some kind of scratching noise, and we stood there for a second just listening, and I decided to peek around the corner to see what was making the sound. What I saw scared the living hell out of me. It was some kind of creature. It was skinny, almost completely naked. I couldn't see any clothes at least. Had really thin strands of hair and was very pale, like corpse pale, almost completely white. The first thing that came to mind was that it resembled Gollum from Lord of the Rings, just bigger. It was crouching down and was scratching the floor, and it made some growly, groany breathing noises. It was facing away from us, so I just stood frozen for a good while and watched. It took a step back and just pointed at this thing and looked at my friend. He peeked around the corner and immediately I could see his facial expression change into a combination of horror and shock. It was reassuring in a way to know he could see it too. We just stood there for a good 20 seconds watching this thing do whatever it was doing, and the most cliché horror movie thing happened. My friend started backing away slowly and while doing so stepped on a piece of glass that cracked. This startled the creature and it quickly looked over its shoulder right at me. I just bolted at that point, and we ran all the way to the basement to get out, and the whole way there I swear it felt like it was right behind us. We ran back to my friend's house, and when we got there we had a kind of debriefing session, making sure that we both saw the same thing. The closest thing to a reference I can find is Gollum. I understand if you think I'm lying. I would be skeptical if someone on the internet was telling me this story, but I swear this actually happened, and my friend confirms it to this day. We got a good enough look at it to confirm that it was humanoid, but didn't really resemble a human being. The only explanation I can think of was that it was a homeless dude that for some reason was naked in this abandoned school, but this is in northern Norway during the winter. You won't survive very long without clothes. Also, I live in a very small town with very few, if any, homeless people, so that would be quite unlikely. It could also be some kind of animal that had found its way inside, but we got a good look at it, and it doesn't resemble any animal I've ever seen before or since. I have no idea what it was. I'm normally a rational, Occam razor kind of person, but we saw what we saw, and we still have no explanation for what that was. I grew up in a rural area of Honduras, a really spiritual country in the middle of Central America, plagued with plenty of paranormal events that may not even compare to many places in the world. The country has a lot of strange and unexplainable things going on, to the point that people are really just into it, and another reason why people became Christian. For a while, the country was the second most dangerous place in the world, with Iraq or Afghanistan being the first. Just let that sink in. When I was in the 4th grade, there were legends people would share about this kid-snatching creature that would look similar to goblins or leprechauns that lived deep in the jungle or forested areas and would snatch kids up. Honestly, at first, I thought it was all just nonsense, but after deeper examination, I came to realize they were very real, and they had some sort of time-manipulating ability in which they would use on groups of kids to get them disoriented to be able to snatch some. After talking to many elders and families of people whose kids were snatched, a lot of cases had the same thing to say, because some kids were able to escape this manipulation, including myself, but it was before it happened to me, that the kids would come back home with their brothers, sisters, and friends missing and would say they lost them by the well. The elders would ask the kids about where this well was, and every time they tried to show them, they never could, and usually just ended up near places like rivers or running water, where obviously there was no well, and the kids were still missing. The elders would proceed to worry and ask the kids why they're so tired. Did they run away from someone? This was legit. This really happened. Questions rose about human or sex trafficking, as it was a prominent thing in the area as well, and obviously everyone was worried about the kids. Not to mention drugs are prominent in the area, including stuff like devil's breath, but in all cases, the situations were very similar with the kids, and they would never be found. Well, now that you've got context, I always thought it was just some weird stuff, until I was about 9. Me and a few friends decided to go swimming on the neighborhood river. We swam for a while till we started to drift a little lower along the river, and we decided to get off in the area that looked like a somewhat clear part filled with sand and small trees. This area specifically was part of a deep forest, so when I got out I started wandering because I'd never been in that area before and was on my own. So I walked along the clear area and saw this really small trail that led to a clearer area, and in front, really sort of close in the middle, was this clear section of jungle that looked really old. Then I saw the well. For some reason I thought about just walking there and taking a closer look, since it was right there. I walked and every time I tried approaching it, it almost felt like the well got further and further instead of closer. I walked again, and as I walked I began hearing voices in the background like people talking, but I knew I was in the middle of a jungle and there wasn't anyone there. So I instantly realized this must have been the stuff the kids were talking about. I turned around, and the river was now nowhere to be seen, and the trail looked like it was miles of trail stretching to the horizon. I ran and ran, closed my eyes and asked God please to take me home. As I ran and cried, the laughter somehow stopped, and felt like something weird was watching me. I got off. My friends said that they couldn't find me and thought I went home, so they went home after half an hour of swimming in the river. But somehow I spent 3 hours there. It still puzzles me, because when I grew up I gained the courage to see if the well was even real, or the trail, and it turns out that it wasn't. I never saw anything. But I came to the conclusion that what really happened was something beyond my comprehension, and that my perception of time and space were messed up because of something insidious happening there. It must have been similar to what the other children experienced, because whatever it was laughing at me when I was trying to run away for miles. But I think what got me off was closing my eyes and asking God to take me home. So I made it, but it was drastically later than the time I felt I spent in there. I've kept quiet about this one for a while because some people really tend to think you're crazy for having an experience like this, and I'm still not able to comprehend what or why I experienced. One night, me and 2 friends were all walking around at night in the fields around a small town in Michigan. Our destination was a junkyard tucked away behind several fields, home to rusted-out cars, semi-trailers, farm equipment, etc. We were cutting through the fields to avoid the trigger-happy farmers that live around there. We were nearly there, and were foiled by a stream which was too wide to leap. It was late autumn, and wet feet would be uncomfortable, so we backtracked into the adjacent field. From our corner of the field there was a tree line that ran east to west, and southward the land rose into a large hill. We stood for a moment, discussing our options, when my eyes were drawn to a large white boulder seeming to glow in the moonlight. It was around 75 yards away, and I was idly staring at it when it moved. It unfolded. Standing at 10 to 12 feet, this bipedal being, skeleton thing, pure white with long limbs. For the space of a second it looked at us, and then took off. I think it was running, but it could have been gliding or flying. Honestly, I don't know. It crossed the field up over the hill, a distance of probably 100 yards in 2 to 3 seconds, in silence, and was then gone. Only 2 of the 3 of us saw it, and after a few minutes of incoherent gibbering, we attempted to rationalize and explain what the hell it was we just saw, and decided it must be some kind of alien. A year later, I was at a party, and the subject of aliens came up. I say that I've seen an alien, and they say, yeah, let me guess, in Saranac, right? I confirm. We exchange mutual looks of awe, and he directs me to his friend Eric, who grew up in said town. Eric tells me he has seen strange things there his whole life, Lights in the sky and stuff, but never humanoid beings. Fast forward another year, and I get a phone call from an acquaintance who was sitting at work when he noticed a girl staring at him strangely. She eventually walks up to him and says, "I feel like I need to talk to you." She proceeded to tell him that her friend's dad is the head of a vampire clan in a town near Saranac. My friend remembers my story about the weird thing in the area, then asks her if she knows anything about Saranac. She gets very defensive and eventually reveals that Saranac is a breeding ground for dragons. Yeah. To this day, I'm not certain if I saw a dragon, an alien, or a vampire, but I did a bit of poking around and I heard from a girl that lived there that she had seen a random 15-foot scorch mark on a roadside in the middle of fields, which was very unnerving. Any illumination or similar tales would be greatly appreciated to help me clear up this matter once and for all. I've grown up with a relatively open mind in regards to strange phenomena, and things that aren't generally accepted by mainstream science or society, but always approach things with an appropriate level of skepticism. I've spent a very large majority of my life in the woods, hunting, fishing, and mountain climbing miles deep in the backcountry. And so within all that time I've observed a number of things that I can't explain away. I've gone camping and trekking solo many times in my life. It was liberating to just pack whatever you needed to survive and go miles deep into the backcountry where animals aren't even afraid of you simply because they aren't familiar with humans. It feels so special to be the only one immersed in that environment, but not anymore. Behind all of the natural beauty is an underlying anxiety, fear, and legitimate danger. An environment that once felt so comforting and therapeutic turned into one that drove me absolutely mad with questions and uncertainties, and is now one I will not enter alone, for I know what's possible and what is truly roaming around the forests of North America. It was 2016 in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, where I saw a creature that forever changed my life and the way I perceive the world we live. The first time I'd ever heard of a creature dubbed the Rake was during a conversation with a friend who had lived in the area for years and had encountered this creature several times in close proximity to his home. I remember him asking me if I'd ever seen anything strange in a large plot of the woods across the street from his house, which at the time I had not. However, long before it was brought up, I'd always had a deep feeling in my chest about this plot of woods. I didn't know what it was, I just knew that it carried a very heavy and dark energy that was really strong enough to encourage you to stay out. My friend took out their phone and showed me a picture of the Rake that comes up with any Google search, a very generic picture. I laughed it off as he warned me about this creature, because I genuinely thought he was just growing weed or something in the woods and didn't want me to find it, when I couldn't have been more wrong. Months had passed, with little more than strange noises at night, and the sound of some big cats being carried off into the dark, until the day that changed my life happened. It was midnight. A rainstorm had just dumped a bunch of rain, and me and a co-worker at the time had just clocked out and were heading to the friend's house, who had warned me originally about this creature. His house is on a long straight road with a dead end, very few houses on one side and woods on the other. As we're heading down the road with high beams on, my co-worker slams on the brakes and starts freaking out, saying that he just saw the creature kneeling down on the shoulder of the road. Instantly, without thought, I jumped out of the car and heard running and crashing through the woods in a parallel line to the road. Thankfully, due to the hard braking, the car shifted slightly so that the high beams were pointing into the woods. When I saw it, that's when it changed my life, my beliefs, and shattered my reality and turned them upside down. At least, a 6-foot-tall, naked creature with greyish-white skin and long arms ran through the section of woods fully illuminated by the headlights, giving me at least 15 seconds of uninterrupted visual contact with the creature, firmly imprinting it in my head. It ran just like a human, however it was incredibly fast and jumping over any obstacle in the way until it reached the point where the headlights no longer illuminated the woods. It then pretended to jump and run deeper into the woods. However, it actually turned and headed back to the road where I lost sight of it, and in the dark part of the woods. As I was standing in the middle of the road, dumbfounded with my jaw to the floor, trying to comprehend the severity of the situation, it crawled out from the woods and crossed the road on all fours 60 yards from me and disappeared into the woods on the other side. I've been tormented by the creature since. It makes me confused, sad, and curious, and I can't get the image out of my head. I can't forget the feeling this creature gave me when I lived there, playing and toying with my head in waking life and in my dreams. I don't go into the backcountry alone anymore. I can't enjoy the solitude without anxiety ruining it, and I can't be free. This creature exists, and so do others, that we just can't understand. And it's important for people to realize this so they can enjoy nature while also being safe. This happened in Juarez, Mexico, when I was a kid. I went to a kids' party with my family. The party, as Mexican parties can be, went on for quite a while. We were in a big ranch with cows, horses, chicken, and other livestock. By the time night fell, we were playing with some kids, and a bit far from our mother's view, when we heard an animal making a very loud noise. It sounded like wings. Imagine what a pterodactyl would sound like. Well, that's what I imagined. We looked to the sky and see what I can only describe as a reptilian creature with big, grey wings. Here in Juarez, I've heard stories about large birds. Some people talk about gargoyles. On the mountains in this region, there are caves, and people who live near them always say they see UFOs and large birds. If you Google it, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. I couldn't see any feathers for sure, but in any case, we were freaked out. One of the kids was terrified, more than the others, and started screaming at the top of his lungs, "A chupacabra." That scared the rest of us, and we all fled to our mums as quickly as we could. I don't think they believed us. They tried calming us down and said that surely we must have just seen roosters. But believe you me, having been at that party a while, we'd seen roosters. This was no rooster. We explained that to them, but they still didn't believe us. She just said we made it up. But I've never forgotten the experience, and it continues to haunt me. Does anyone know what I may have witnessed? It all started as a warm night. May 28th. Nothing was out the ordinary. My friends and I were playing video games on a high school night, procrastinating homework and yelling at each other about some stupid problems in the game. When we grew tired of our game, I signed off for the night. I didn't live far from the general store, so I thought I may as well hop on my bike, ride there to grab some cream soda and sunflower seeds, so I did. The bike ride usually lasts about 10 minutes. The bike ride consisted of going through my neighborhood, a scary-ass bike trail, then another neighborhood. So I put in my earbuds and just rode there. I got all the way there when I realized I didn't have my wallet, which was very disappointing since it was getting dark. I got back on my bike and started the ride back. Usually when I go back, I cut through a backyard instead of taking the trail. It's mainly downhill on the way back, so I usually don't take the trail back. But for some reason I felt compelled to go down the trail like a pull. When I was riding down, I heard an inhuman scream, a mix between a bald eagle and a human scream. I, of course, looked towards where the sound was coming from, and I saw an extremely skinny, super pale, tall figure get on all fours and start running for me. When I say extremely skinny, I mean it was skin and bone, and the legs and arms were super long. The face was nearly featureless besides a mouth and 2 black eyes, and I got the hell out of there as fast as my bike could handle. I know I wasn't imagining it. I now have my license, and refuse to go down that trail when it's remotely close to dark. I was going to take my dog out to take a piss out in the yard. The moon shined just enough that I could see. My dog wasn't coming when I called, so I scanned the yard and found him and picked him up. I spotted what I thought was my dog 40 feet or so in front of me, but it had no head, no legs, and no tail. I just figured it was my dog turned around, holding his face and nibbling an itch. I was confused because it moved like an earthworm, squirming slightly, almost melding with the ground. That's what I thought. I couldn't really see because it was dark out, so I called my dog's name and he showed up beside me, ready to go in. All of a sudden, I couldn't see this weird creature in my yard. I told my dog to run inside, and I ran in with him. I still don't know what I saw. This happened when I was living in Needleville, Texas. I left my mum's house to go feed our dogs that were living at my grandma's house. She had space for them, so we stayed there, and we lived a few miles down the street. This was a little after the 2008 crash, and we had lost our home back in South Carolina like most other people had, so we had moved into a smaller rental property in the middle of pretty much nowhere. Needleville is a tiny farm town with about 300 people tops. It was a hot, muggy summer evening, and I headed over to go see my grandma and chit-chat for a bit. I fed the dogs and hung out with my grandma for a few hours. It got dark out, and I decided that I should head back home. So I got back in my car and drove back home. When I started pulling up on my mum's house, though, I see a large, squatting shape in the driveway like a gorilla. I start to immediately enter the driveway, slowly, and as soon as my tires hit the gravel, it immediately whips around to face me. Then and there, lit up in my headlights, is this hulking creature about the same size and build as a gorilla, but covered in thick, silver fur, and had a huge, bulbous, ruby red, chitinous eyes, and with a gruesome, snarling mouth of sharp, white teeth that appeared to be a good 2 to 3 inches long. It had a small forehead and a round head that was about the same size as a human head, also covered in the same thick silver fur. In the moment that it heard my tires hit gravel, it turned, snarled, and bared its teeth at my car for a brief moment, then immediately turned towards the bushes on the other side of the yard and kicked off with its feet, just like a gorilla would. It loped off into the bushes. Alternatively, it swinged on its hands, landing on its feet, and disappeared into the bushes. I pulled into my mum's driveway and just waited in my car for a minute to let the thing run away before I bolted to the house. As soon as the light on the front porch came on and my sister poked her head out to see why I wasn't inside yet, I launched my happy ass right out of the car and full-on sprinted to the door. I never saw the creature ever again after that, but that didn't stop me from being vigilant for a few months after. I was visiting Honduras and discussing the paranormal with my cousin. They said they've never seen a ghost, but everyone had a duende story. The most interesting thing was about a schoolmate of my cousin's. My cousin's schoolmate was a beautiful blonde girl, inside and out, not conceited, super sweet and friends with everyone, especially the town losers, as they refer to themselves, my cousin being one of them. You know, the unpopular kids at school. She had a duende that was following her since she was 8 years old. He was obsessed with her and would throw rocks at any boy that attempted to date her. As she grew older, it got annoying that her suitors would be scared away by this rock-throwing elf. My cousin told her to tell the elf to go away. She replied, "Any man scared of an elf is not worthy of my affection." Ha! You go, girl. Well, fast forward to her being a 30-year-old virgin. She got a boyfriend who was not afraid of the elf and continued to date her even though this elf messed with him a lot, throwing rocks, stealing his keys, and leaving nails around his car. She lost her virginity to him, and apparently the elf was so disgusted, he finally left her alone. Another story comes from my grandmother. When she was 40, doctors told her she'd be completely blind by the age of 50. She's very religious and not superstitious at all, but became desperate to save her sight. A neighbor told her about a herbalist living in the mountains of Copan who had a whistling duende as her assistant. My grandma went with her to visit the woman. She told the woman what the doctors said about her eyes, and the woman translated to the duende by whistling. My grandmother and her friend said they didn't see it, but they did hear it whistle back in response. The duende whistled to the woman and gave my grandmother some herbs he gathered. My grandmother took the strange herbs, and although her eyesight did not get better, it did not get worse. She passed away at age 70, with the same eye prescription she had at 40. Not all duendes are evil, I imagine. And my last story is about a friend of mine. He said he had a witch for a grandmother, and while staying with her in her hut, she would tell my friend and her sister to stay away from a tree in particular, because that is where the duende lived. The story goes that the duende will steal little blonde girls. My friend said she didn't believe in witches or elves, and thought her grandmother made the story up to keep her close to the house. Well, one afternoon they were playing hide-and-seek near the tree to be naughty, and after counting to 10, she saw something run behind the tree and followed it thinking it was her sister. She found her sister staring wide-eyed at something, and it was a duende. She was 10 years old at the time. It was shorter than her, had a pointy red hat and a very wrinkled face, almost like an opossum, and was smiling ear to ear. It reached over to grab her little sister, who's blonde, but she grabbed her sister first and they took off running to the house. When they got to the house, they told their grandmother about the encounter and she simply said, "I told you to stay away from there. Listen to your witch grandma." I'm not entirely sure why, but allegedly, the duendes prefer blonde hair as it resembles gold. But I'll never know for sure. I grew up in the Midwest and would spend a lot of time on the family farm, roughly 150 acres of just soybean and nothing, which was surrounded by a small wooded area. One night when I was about 12 or so, I heard some cats fighting outside, so I grabbed a flashlight and started heading out. It sounded like it was coming from the woods, so I started walking there. When I was close to the edge of the trees, I shone my flashlight in and saw an eye shine. I thought it was a cat, so I made a noise to try to get it to move, and made a few more steps forward. I don't know what it was, but it was not a cat. I remember it ran towards me and made some sort of low rumbling noise. It pushed against my legs and I lost my balance. As I did, I put my hand out to grab onto something and I felt it. It felt like bare skin. No fur, just skin. It was about the size of a large dog. It ran off after only knocking me over, but that was enough to shake me up. To this day I have no clue what the hell I encountered, and it bothers me whenever I think about it. There is a park and trail in a wooded area right behind my house. Very close to it, there's a playground with a basketball court. And it's a neighborhood park that often has a lot of people around it, even at night for the skate park and basketball court. I often walk from my backyard to the playground with my siblings, and we felt like fishing in the little swampy lake area. It was around 9 p.m. I walked from my backyard with my little sister and my boyfriend to the playground. It was getting dark, and my boyfriend was still playing basketball with my cousins, who drove to the park and met us there. So my little sister and I decided to go back home by ourselves as it was a short walk. We were walking our usual route, and the backyards of other homes are very visible to us. And so is ours, but it's a little further away from the playground, and we're the only people who have a big, tall white fence, so you can't see over our yard. Anyway, we walk closer, but before we could get that far, I suddenly feel the instinct to look at something. I stop walking our usual route and turn my head slightly to the right to see a tall, white figure. At this point, it's light enough outside to see something far, but not too dark to see it that clearly. And the figure is like unhuman, nor anything I've ever seen in my life. I tried to think hard of what it was, but I realized it looked like it was coming towards my sister and I. It was about 20 feet away. Thinking I was a little crazy, I asked my sister if she could see it and pointed at it. In fright, she said yes, and I said, I think it's running at us. So we both ran back to the court where my cousins and boyfriend were, and we ran really fast because we were very scared. I'll try my best to describe the figure or what I saw, but it's hard. There was a really tall white stick, 10 feet tall, and it was waving in a weird way, like really fast. And I thought it may be a deer, because we've seen one there before, but it was always way too tall and weird looking, like an object, not a human. I'm a 21-year-old and I'm Christian, and I've never seen anything paranormal, but that weird thing my sister and I encountered was simply unexplainable. Because we always use that route and it's right behind our house. I just wonder if anyone has ever seen anything similar. My parents and others won't believe me, and even my sister is doubting she really saw it now. We got too scared to walk back, and luckily my brother came in the car to pick us up. The figure wasn't scary at first, it was just so confusing, and I was perplexed, trying to understand what it could be. But then I feared for my sister, as I saw it ambling towards us. What the hell did we encounter then? This happened when I was around 5. My family and I went to the Lake District in the UK for a small holiday. We went to a lodge. One day when I was there, I looked out of the window to a bunch of dead bushes and a tree. It was winter, and I was looking for a good 2 minutes when suddenly from the corner of my eye, a massive ball of what appeared to be fur hopped or waddled into the forest. So I watch it until I can't see it anymore, and my mum said it must have been a hare or a rabbit, but the thing was it was about the size of 2 car wheels stacked on top of each other, about the size of half a monster truck wheel. I'm fat, but I could only see the back of it, and hares and rabbits are small. So I started thinking it was a bear, but bears aren't native to the UK, and I can't find anything that it could have been online. It was like a brown or dark beige. I looked every day for about an hour, but never saw anything like it, or what it could have been again. A friend of mine and I were hiking through the woods. It was dark out and we were beginning to head back home, when something came across the path by a fallen tree. It's hard to describe, but it looked like a man in a hooded cloak. It stood and then slowly and silently moved to a tree and keeled. We couldn't see its face, but we got the feeling it was watching us. We tried to shrug it off and kept moving. Further down the trail, we saw it again. Being in our early teens, we decided stupidly that we were going to get to the bottom of this, so we started after it and began charging it. We screamed and it stopped, and it took off into the woods. Feeling brave again, I grabbed a big spear-shaped stick and took off after it. I ran for a bit through the woods until I could see the outline of it once more up ahead through the moonlight. I knelt and watched as another popped up beside it, and another. Then I heard movement to the side of me, realizing that whatever these things were surrounding me, and I quickly noped out in the direction I left my friend. I know it sounds like the creepy part, but it gets weirder. My friend wasn't there when I left them, so I called out to him. He responded a little way away and followed with, "You gotta see this." So I followed his voice and came out to a clearing. It was bright as hell, and floating around the clearing were legit balls of light, almost like the fairy fountains from The Legend of Zelda, those red balls that float near the fountain. Except these were pure white light. We looked at each other and then hightailed it back to the trail and back home. It was definitely the strangest thing I've ever experienced. I was riding in the car with one of my friends and her mum back in middle school. We stopped at Quick Trip before school to get a drink. I obviously left my backpack in the car, but when I got back, the mum told me she heard a growling noise coming from my bag. I didn't believe her, but she said it was true. I didn't think about it too much. I did think my house was haunted for a while due to knocking in the windows at one point, but I chose not to believe it. Later that evening, I went to my bathroom to wash my face and brush my teeth, and then I heard it. The growling. I leaned towards my backpack, which was leaning against my desk. Surely it had to be my dog's, but neither were in my room. I tried to think of any other things in my room that could have made that noise, but I couldn't think of any reasonable explanation. I immediately emptied my backpack out completely, but didn't find anything. And I often wonder on what it could have been. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's collection of stories. If of course you did, don't forget to let me know down below. You'd be surprised how far a comment and a like, subscribing and pressing the bell button, how far that goes really. It does go a long way, and I will love you forever if you do so. Hope we're having a fun time with our week in the woods. Hey, maybe that's what we should call it. Our week in the woods. It's been a blast so far, and there are even more surprises in store for tomorrow. So I'm hoping to see you there. I'm going to leave it here for now though. And as always, a huge thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. I love you guys forever. And yes, if any of you want to join, follow the links in the description to do that. But for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.